certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Details of the dramatic early morning raid and arrest of Bradley Edwards was revealed in court today for the very first time. Welcome to day 52 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo in the studio with Alison Fan, and Tim Clark has just stepped out of court to join us. Well, we all vividly remember the day of this arrest, but now you've heard a very detailed account of exactly how the operation was executed.
Yes, this came from the first police officer, who is part of a very, very big team, Detective Senior Constable Ian Berry. He was actually part of the search team where they had a search warrant, but he followed the TRG, which is our specialist police task force, heavily armed, who burst into this home in Kewdale back in December 2016 and probably brought to a head WA's biggest and longest manhunt when they arrested Telstra technician Bradley Robert Edwards.
So, Tim, this must have been really interesting detail that came out today.
Yeah, it was, Nat. Just to have one of the police officers who was there on that day was interesting enough, and it was a part of a big team, as he said. And I don't suppose DSC Berry would mind saying that he wasn't front and centre, but he was certainly part of that team that went in and spent basically 2 days going through 344 Acton Avenue in Kewdale with a very fine-tooth comb. He said there was TRG, so they're the heavily armed police. Then there was another team that was the team that was actually to take Mr. Edwards away for questioning, and then the searchers went into the home and went through absolutely everything. And Ian Berry was one of those, and his role today was to tell us, in particular, the pieces of evidence that we've heard about previously back in the first month of the trial, personal to Mr. Edwards, that he found in the house and was then tasked to investigate further on. And then he also told us a little bit of other tasks that he was asked to do in terms of the investigation, basically right up until the middle of last year. And then he was in court today to talk about it.
So during this 2-day search, what did he find that was of note and was of interest?
Well, it was a notebook, Nat, that actually didn't belong to Mr. Edwards. It belonged to his
second wife.
His second wife. We heard about this, as I say, right back at the start of the trial, during the so-called Edwards brief, which was all about his personal life, and it was to do with the bank details that his wife had taken it upon herself to tabulate in a notebook, in pen, in her own handwriting, of all the withdrawals that Mr. Edwards had made over several years, including 96 and 97, which are obviously the times of interest. Listeners who have been with us from the start may remember this was some discussion because the second wife, Mr. Edwards' second wife, said she did this because she was scared stiff of something, but we never found out what, because when she said that comment at this time, when she was being asked about this notebook, she was actually stopped in her tracks and said, "No, you don't need to go there," which was one of these many unanswered questions that we've had throughout the trial.
We were all very frustrated by that at the time.
She said she was sick of his lies too, as to why she was secretly recording the details of his ATM withdrawals, which of course, 2 of them from Claremont, which Edwards had denied ever being in Claremont prior to 2009. And the transaction showed there were a couple of withdrawals the 13th of December, 1996.
And that was at Bayview Terrace,
That was Bayview Terrace, Bank West, yeah.
Yeah, which was just metres from the Conti and Club Bayview, where we know the girls were and were last seen at. And then it also, and the reason this was brought by the prosecution was to belie the statement that Mr. Edwards made in his police interview, where he said, "Oh no, I didn't go near Claremont. I didn't know it very well. I hardly ever went there." And this was to show that on consecutive weeks in December, '96, not only was he there, but he was actually withdrawing money for what purpose we don't know.
And I think from memory, he had said that he had never been to Claremont prior to 2009.
Yeah, it was something along those lines, Nat. You're absolutely right. And that was obviously the prosecution, when they found this notebook in the house, this interested them greatly. And that's why DSC Berry was tasked to track down these withdrawals and to see if the old Mrs. Edwards had jotted them down right. And so he was tasked to get in touch with the banks, try and find the withdrawals and the statements, and cross-check them off. And so that's what he did, and it took him some time, but that was one of his jobs.
And looking at the vision, I just went back and had a look at the vision for tonight's television story, and they were bringing out cartons and cartons of stuff from the house. It was sort of like just never-ending carrying out stuff. Of course, some of it we're told can't be brought into this trial because the judge previously didn't think it was relevant, did he? I mean, there was some stuff that was going to come out, but we have heard about some of the more interesting aspects that he had on his television or his recordings. But
devices.
Yeah.
You don't might you want me?
I do. You can go for that, Tim. You can get done on that.
Poor Alison, that's what they found. Hundreds and thousands of pornographic pictures, stories, videos, which the prosecution wanted to bring forward as evidence, but Justice Hall pre-trial ruled that that wouldn't help him in his deliberations. So he ruled it out. So we won't hear about that in trial, but we have heard about it in pre-trial, which is why we're free to talk about it. There's been judgments made on it, very detailed judgment made on it, which is why we know that it was more than 100,000 pornographic pictures on various devices, and nearly 10% of those were to do with degrading material and rape fantasies and the like. So that was part of the mass of material that would have been taken from that house. But we only heard a tiny little slice of that today through DSC Berry. But we are expecting more macro detectives, particularly Detective Maripodi, who was also at the scene on the day. And
took him away, didn't he?
Took him away and interviewed him, so that he will be one of many police officers we'll probably hear from.
They moved very quickly that day because Detective Berry was saying that by the time he got there, which was shortly after, they had already arrested and whisked Bradley Edwards away and taken him back to the Special Crime Squad headquarters. And that was earlier in the morning. I actually think it was just after dawn that they burst into the Kudar house, as the TRG tend to do. And so then after that, Detective Berry was quite a busy man.
Indeed, yeah. He was kept very busy, Matt, with these investigative tasks and some tasks later on last year, actually, where he was tasked to take some exhibits over to Victoria as well.
So what did he take over to Victoria? So this is in 2019. He's taking some DNA samples across the country.
Yes, that's right. So he was tasked to take some quite important exhibits, actually, relating to Kira, and he was tasked to take them to the Victoria Forensic Institute, which is one of the leading DNA labs in Australia, where they do a lot of work for Victorian police, obviously, and other outside agencies, which includes the West Australian Police. So DSC Berry took these items, which were DNA samples, hair samples and the like, over to Victoria so they could be retested to validate that they actually came from Kira's post-mortem. So that was what that little trip over was for, and today's evidence was to get all the continuity in place, show photos of the exhibits, the labelling, how they were packaged, how they were taken, whether they were left anywhere, and who they were assigned when they got to Victoria. And we can. The interesting thing about that is the date that this occurred, which was the middle of last year. So Mr. Edwards has already been in custody for more than 2 years by then, but there's still this intensive investigative work going on for years after his arrest, basically right up until weeks before the trial.
And it's very interesting, the investigations that were taking place last year, because Detective Berry was also asked to investigate historical fireworks. Now, how did he go about that?
That was to do with the so-called request from his wife to go and watch fireworks, and he had to shore up the date of when that occurred, whether it was Australia Day, and he said yes, there were fireworks on Australia Day. We're talking about the day that Sarah Spiers went missing, when Edwards was said by the prosecutors to have felt so rejected by his wife that he then came up to Claremont and abducted and took Sarah Spiers. That's the prosecution's case. So we had to check, were there fireworks in this area, because this was the conversation that they had. And Tim, he did that, didn't he?
Yes. I'm not sure how happy he would have been when he was given this task to do, but he did it very diligently. As Ali said, the records from the local council had been destroyed. They'd only been kept 7 years or so. This is Mandurah, which is about 40 minutes south of Perth, beautiful area. And so DS Berry had to go to the library, old school, and basically pull every single copy of the Mandurah Mail from 1995 and 1996, the hard copies, which the State Library have very diligently kept, and go through every single one, which he did over 2 years, over 2 days. It took him over 2 years to find any mention of any local fireworks display. And what he found there were 3 over that period of 2 years, and one of them, lo and behold, was on Australia Day 1996, which we know is the last day of Sarah Spiers' life, and also the night that Mr. Edwards is said to have gone down and to supposedly try and reconcile with his then estranged wife, and that was rebuffed. And yes, it was the let me have a look. I've got the exhibit right in front of me. It's the Cape Bouvard Monster Fireworks display. It was on at 8:30 p.m. on that evening. So it would, if Mr. Edwards' first wife, estranged wife at the time, is right, that is the event that she was invited to, and that was the event that Mr. Edwards wanted to take her to, but didn't get to. And the prosecution's case, of course, is after that rebuff. He drove back to Perth, abducted Sarah, and what he allegedly did with her then his killer, and obviously we don't know where her remains are to this day. What we do know is that he went to work that following weekend.
That's right,
It was a long weekend. He was at work. We had with several of his colleagues testify that they remember him getting to work. About what time, we don't know. Apparently it was just another normal working day for Mr. Edwards on that day. And so that is the window between him being supposedly rebuffed by his estranged wife, obviously prior to the fireworks, which we now know started at 8:30, and then he attended work at around about 8 a.m. the following morning. So it's in that window.
You know, I was very interested that Detective Berry wasn't cross-examined today, because we've had in excess of, 150 witnesses, and most of them have been cross-examined. So it was interesting to me that defence didn't go down that path with Detective Berry.
A few things about that, Nat. I mean, one, Mr. Yovich has already said he's got no issues with the way Mr. Edwards was arrested. There's no issues with the arrest warrant or anything along those lines, so he wouldn't need to question the officer there. This fireworks, well, we know what Mr. Edwards says, we know what the ex-wife says, and we know what this newspaper article says. So if he was going to ask the officer how he went about that would have been, a pretty lame question, because just sitting in a library, there's no real issue with that. And the trip to Victoria, once again, it was to establish the items were from Kira's postmortem. We don't think there's any challenge to that. So he obviously felt that the evidence spoke for itself, and he didn't need to really dig into it too much.
Tim, what do you make of the DNA from Louise King?
Yes, so that was a bit more controversial, I've got to say. So Louise King was the Path West scientist that was giving evidence today. We knew she was being called because of her work that she'd done on several of the items of interest, including the knife that was found near Jane's body. But in cross-examination, we then found out that she is or was one of the Path West scientists that whose DNA had been found on important exhibits when it wasn't supposed to be there, contamination. And what we also found out for the first time today is this contamination event wasn't one of the ones that was mentioned by Mr. Yovich in opening. So this is another one on top. This is a separate item, RH22 and RH9, which are pieces of vegetation that were found near one of the crime scenes, and when they were examined later, they were shown to have Miss King's DNA on it.
She didn't know that, though, did she?
Well, she didn't know it at the time. She was asked whether she'd been told at the time whether she'd found that out, and she said no. She'd found it out in preparation for the trial. That other obviously tests had been done on that vegetation, we believe by the UK lab Cellmark, looking for other DNA, and they found it. But obviously the Path West would have preferred that they hadn't found Miss King's DNA on there, because it certainly wasn't supposed to be there.
And in the examination of the knife that was found in Wellard, what tests did she run on that?
So that was what we've heard about, presumptive tests. So it's a pre-test done before they do the full DNA testing, to ascertain whether there's anything there. There's two that they do, one for blood and one for DNA. Miss King ran both of those and got nothing, got absolutely no sign of anything, either DNA-wise or blood on the blade, on the handle, and even in the interior sort of workings of the knife. She was asked to swab inside the knife where the knife blade actually goes into the handle. All that was done, and nothing came back. So the full DNA and blood analysis wasn't done because they weren't getting any hits off the presumptive tests, which I'm sure would have been a little bit of a blow to the investigators, who would have been desperate to see if there was anything that they could get off that knife to connect it directly to Jane.
Because we all were quite excited when we first heard about that Telstra knife, but then it just didn't go anywhere, and now it's been confirmed that they found nothing on it at all.
And she did mention that she had found on, I think, the tip of the knife a sticky, green, yellowy substance. But was that tested?
Well, she was testing for something in particular, well, two things in particular, obviously blood and DNA. And so when she couldn't really ascertain what that was, they really need to know what it is before they can test for it, if you know what I mean. But what they did test is whether the knife was sharp, and that was as simple as trying to cut a piece of paper with it, and it sliced through that quite easily. So this knife was considered sharp. We've seen pictures of it. It wasn't that rusty. There were little rust spots on it, but it wasn't in a sort of degraded state or anything like that. But it also wasn't contaminated with anything that might help investigators.
And we're going to continue, are we, Tim, with the hearing more forensic scientists? I thought actually we were heading towards the police team, who I can understand a lot better because they speak in mums and dads' language, don't have to suffer through all the scientific acronyms that are over there. But it seems like we're going backwards to them and then some more, and the judge is getting a little bit cranky over...
Oh, yes, ever.
There was a bit of tenseness today, wasn't there?
Very, yes, it did get a bit testy this afternoon. So Ali's right. I mentioned it a couple of days ago. I was talking to Damien Cripps outside court, and he labelled it the grind, when you could just really get into the guts of the real technical evidence, and we saw a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel when DSC Berry was giving his evidence this morning. But then this afternoon, Andrew McDonald, who is a very senior scientist with Path West, had been at Cellmark before that, and had been at FSS before that. So he's worked for all three of these labs that are so vital to this case, but he's now resident in Perth. And he was called to give evidence about testing that Cellmark had done in 2017 and 2018. So we're jumping to after Mr. Edwards was arrested. And police sent all the fingernail exhibits, apart from 40, 42 and 48, over to the UK again to be retested again using their ultra-modern DNA techniques to see if they could glean anything else. And Mr. McDonald, who's the lead DNA scientist at Cellmark at the time, a reporting scientist who's qualified to give evidence in court, and so that's what he did today. And he told us that when all those tests were done with the super-duper extra cycles and extra alleles looked for, they found nothing but Kira's DNA, which the judge was a bit perturbed about. And then he raised it quite sternly with one of the prosecutors, Miss Tara Payne, who was leading this evidence. And he asked her in no uncertain terms, well, why are you telling me this? What's the point of all this? And Miss Payne bravely and gamely tried to explain why, and made a good point that it showed not only that there was no other suspect, so we're not looking for someone else, but there was also no other contamination of all these other fingernails, which are both quite valid. But the judge said, surely there's an easier, simpler, quicker way you can tell me all this. And so he basically sent them all off with a flea in their ear for about 20 minutes to go and get some documents so they could put up on the court screens. And once we got back, Miss Payne raced through. It was very brief evidence after that, which confirmed everything she said. It was done in an abridged fashion, shall we say, to try and appease Justice Hall's slightly irritable questioning of why he was listening to all this.
So it sounds more and more like he is just after very, very concise information.
Well, it's relevant information, I think, more than concise now. I think he's quite happy to hear it at length if it needs to be done at length. But
there's a lot of duplication.
There was a spreadsheet, a very comprehensive spreadsheet placed on the screen that Mr. McDonald and another colleague had made of all the results, and it took Justice Hall about 2 minutes to scan it, where it was taking us 2 minutes to just decipher it, and he scanned it all and said, look, I see all this. What's it all about? Why do I need to see this? Well, why do I need to go through it all? There's nothing that links it to Mr. Edwards. There's nothing links it to anyone else. So what's the point of it? And so that, as I say, led to an abridged version. Not unimportant, but I think done in the way that he would have preferred, which was short and sharp and to the point.
Because everything, of course, it's presented, he has to analyse and then give a reason why it's important or it's not important, and goodness me, there's just so much paperwork. And so we get a bit of a breather tomorrow to regroup, do we? Yes, we do. So Mr. McDonald will have to come back because he wasn't cross-examined today. So that will be interesting because, again, that will go to some of these contamination events, because it was Cellmark who actually discovered a couple of these contamination events that were raised by Mr. Jovich way back in his opening in November. And these are to do with Jane's fingernails, some intimate swabs that were taken from Jane and Kira, and some vegetation. So Cellmark found all those when they were testing this big batch of exhibits. So we'll get to hear that on Thursday, because Mr. Jovich says, can I have a little bit of time to go through some very late disclosure that I got yesterday or this morning. So he needs a little bit of time. So the judge has given everyone 24 hours just to get their heads together.
So that's unusual. They're not, when this has happened before and there's been this adjournment, we've sort of pushed through other witnesses. That's not happening tomorrow?
Well, no, because we're getting towards the end of the DNA portion of the trial now, and there's not actually that many witnesses to go. So they can't bring other witnesses in out of time relating to the fibres, for instance, because that would throw everything out, and that would, the prosecution are trying to keep it all as compacted into blocks as they can. So, and obviously we haven't heard from Dr. Whitaker yet. There are other Path West people to come, as I mentioned last night. Egan, who's very senior, and that will take some time. So rather than mix it all up again and maybe get out of sequence, the judge was quite happy for Mr. Jovich to be accommodated to get the time to go through the other stuff. And of course, if they were to bring other witnesses in tomorrow, it would mean Mr. Jovich is in court, concentrate on that evidence and not maybe getting the time that he's asked for to get his cross-examination all clear and free in his mind. So, look, it might feel like we're losing a day, but in the grand scheme of things, if it can maybe give Mr. Jovich some time to really pinpoint on the things he wants to look at, it might actually save some time in the long run.
I can only imagine for all of those involved, a day of reprieve here and there would probably be a welcome thing, not just for the lawyers, but for the families and everyone else who's attending court and, even yourselves.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're the last. I mean, Mr. Edwards will have to get up early tomorrow and get on the bus and come to court and then go home. The security guards will get a day off. The court staff, the associates who are working so hard for Justice Hall, getting all the exhibits and evidence up on the screens in double quick time. So everyone just gets a little breather, which...
Except for Mr. Jovich.
Well,
right.
But yeah, I say that. It gets a breather out of court. I'm sure Ms. Barbagallo and her team will be cracking on with some stuff that they've got to do as well. So yeah, it gives everyone a little bit of time out of court, but of course both those teams will be working super hard, as I'm sure me and Ali will on stuff that we've got to do as too.
Well, thank you both for your time today. So just to recap there, court won't be sitting tomorrow, but we will be back with a bonus episode in which we'll speak to journalists who were on the scene that morning when Edwards was arrested. And we hope to have your company then. Bye for now.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.